I want to be true to what I'm trying to say. Whether that means something comes across as me sonically or not, I mean, that's left up to the listener. Like, that's up to you. I personally don't care if you hear one of my pieces and go, oh yeah, that's Daijana. I want you to hear my piece and go, oh yeah, that's whimsical. Or yeah, that's very thoughtful. Or wow, I could really hear what you're trying to explain in the program notes. Like, that is more of what I care about, as opposed to, are the sounds that are made consistent with this idea of voice, right? I want everything to be different, because that's my intention when going with the piece.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Welcome to the show today. If this is your first time listening, well, greetings. Glad to have you here. My name is Tyler. I'm a composer, a radio broadcaster, and a podcaster. And on this podcast, I sit down with other creatives to learn about their journey and discuss their process, philosophies, and everything about their craft and everything in between. And of course, if you've made your way back here, it's great to see you again. On today's Music Maker, I'm joined by composer Daijana Wallace. Daijana Wallace is a composer and educator based in Wichita, Kansas. Her music is an outward reflection of her own introspection, drawing inspiration from any and every thought that crosses her mind, from the mundane aspects of daily life to specific memories. Daijana's compositions have been heard at venues like the Wichita Art Museum and MASS MoCA, as well as the PASIC and International Society of Basses conferences. Daijana holds a Bachelor's Degree from Wichita State University and a Master's Degree from Michigan State University. And when she's not busy composing, she's teaching music in the greater Wichita area. In this conversation, Daijana and I wade into some complex and heavy subject matter. She shares how tragedy sparked her journey as a composer, the struggles that she faced in her work after George Floyd's untimely demise, and what it took to bounce back from an ensuing artistic slump. But we also talk about how intentionality is a big part of her compositional thinking, and even get to talk about some of her hobbies. I think this is quite a thought-provoking discussion, and I'm really just so glad to share it with you today. A little bit of business to share before we jump into this episode. One of the simplest and indeed the best way to support this podcast is by listening to this episode, listening to earlier episodes, and then, maybe more importantly, following the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. That'll ensure that you get the newest episode as soon as it's released and pushed straight to your device. Shout out to the Patreon fam. As of recording this episode, we've got 20 amazing Patreon supporters who make this podcast possible, and you can join them. Support what we're doing on Patreon, and you'll get early access to episodes by becoming a subscriber for just $5 a month. And yes, that little bit of support goes a long way in helping me cover the cost of some tools that I use to produce this podcast. I also just launched a new Patreon exclusive feature called The Workshop, and that's sort of like an audio journal where I share a little bit about my own creative process as it pertains to some current composition projects I'm working on. I've been told it's quite a bit more intimate than the podcast, actually. It's a space for me to kind of be vulnerable, and folks seem to be enjoying it, so that's an occasional feature I'll continue to share for anyone who gives any amount of money on the Patreon, $2 a month or $5 a month. You can find a Patreon link and other ways to financially support the podcast on our website at looseleaftransmissions.com/support. Finally, an impactful and free way to help the Music Maker podcast is to spread the word. You can tell a friend, or you could also leave a rating and a review on the app you're listening to this on right this very moment. The more of those that we have, the more visibility the podcast has, and the more that the podcast can grow. So I really appreciate you doing that, and thanks so much. All right, on to my conversation with Daijana Wallace. Well, Daijana, I'm actually surprised that it took us this long to meet up and talk, because I feel like mainly thanks to Michael Junta, a percussionist. We've kind of been in one another's orbit, and we've worked on some projects of his, not together, but we've been a part of that. So I'm really excited to hear more about your journey and the way you compose, and just kind of learn more about what makes you you today. So thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I did this in this last interview where I said excited like 30 times. So I'm sure I'll do that this time. I'm so excited to be here and chat with you. So,
Hey, excited is a good thing, so I'll take it.
okay.
So where we always begin here on Music Maker is pretty much as far back as you'd like to. And so my first question is, what is your earliest artistic memory as a composer, or even just as a maker, as your earliest memory making something?
Yeah, so my earliest memory is actually growing up in church and singing in church choir. So my mom always wanted us, me and my brothers, to be involved in something musical. And so that started with the youth choir at the church that I grew up in. And I think that sort of makes its way into my music and things that I think about how I want my music to be and how I want my practice to be is always being around somebody and like always lifting each other up. That's definitely something that you experience even at such a young age. So as early as I can remember, like my first memories, I was always singing in church choir, which is there's nothing else like it. I don't know if you've heard gospel music before or
Oh
like
yeah.
experienced it live. I don't know how to explain the feelings that you feel, but there's something really beautiful about just coming together and making music in that way. So that's like my first earliest memory. And then when I got into middle school, the orchestra program in my district just restarted after like a 20-year hiatus or something like that. Maybe it was longer. And I really wanted to play the flute. And my mom was like, "Oh, well, you took violin lessons like fourth grade. Maybe you should like be in the school orchestra." And I was like, "Okay, mom." And then I have been playing cello a little bit after that ever since then. So it's been like my formative years have always been surrounded by music making in some sort of capacity, which has been really amazing.
That's great. You say that your mom wanted you to participate in music. Is she also a musician, or is it just, she recognized this is an important thing for my children to do?
So my mom isn't necessarily a musician, like the professional sense of the word, but she is also very involved in choir. She can play piano a little bit if she really wants to learn a song or something like that. But I think it also has to do with her upbringing as well, like her always being in church. Whenever we went to go see my grandma, we were always in church. She was always singing. So I think it's like her love of that and just wanting, like her just wanting to share that with us or see how we can come into our own in that regard.
Yeah, that's great. You mentioned, playing in the orchestra, playing cello, and you, like you said, you still do that. What was growing up in the Midwest like as a young musician? And do you feel like I ask about the Midwest because I feel like there's such an emphasis in our world of contemporary classical music of like the big cities, like New York City and LA, and that's not my background, and it sounds like that's not your background either. So I'm always interested to hear what that was like for people who kind of grew up in more rural communities maybe, or just, away from the coasts, and what kind of influence maybe that has on your music today.
Let me just start with the first part of the question. Growing up in the Midwest, I grew up in a really small town. Depending on who you ask if it's small, I think it's still pretty small.
Yeah.
We only have like one Walmart that's like the center point of our town, that kind of thing. So I grew up like not taking any lessons on my instrument, which is like a huge faux pas as a string player. But I just grew up kind of really self-motivated. So I was like, oh, I want to learn something on my instrument. I'm going to try to teach myself to do that. So I was like very much a self-starter. And I didn't come into like contemporary classical music until I was around 20 when I transferred from community college to my undergraduate degree. And it was like a whole new world opening up for me. I think the first piece that my teacher assigned was like George Crumb's Black Angels,
Yeah.
the string quartet, and he actually had the giant scores. So I took home that score, and then I also took home the score of Ancient Voices of Children. And so I'm in my apartment with these giant scores flipping through, just getting destroyed by this music, and just being like, wow, there's so many amazing things that I can sort of do. And being the sort of like self starter that I am, the sort of attitude that I've had, I sort of like dove into it. Whenever somebody recommended something for me to listen to go see, like I was just eating it all up, consuming everything, every bit of it. And so I don't have any preconceived notions of like what contemporary classical music should be or what it is. It's just by what people are showing me, what I take interest in, always wanting to continue learning. Even now, I'm not set in a certain like style or a certain like language, musical language that I have for my own, because I'm always just wanting to expand. How can I write a piece differently? How can I do this differently? And every single piece I try to approach from a new perspective. And I think that's really, really helped me, like not having been set in stone from a certain point, just always trying to keep going and moving forward. So,
Yeah, I totally relate to that because I kind of didn't have any formal training as a composer either until I was maybe 21 or 22. But I so relate to what you're saying about George Crumb, and I think it's interesting. You talk about Crumb's scores, but not his music necessarily. And that was kind of similar to me. I remember going into the library at my undergrad, which did not have a composition program, and finding I think it was the score to Crumb's Star Child, and just like you said, it was like in the oversized score section, and just like staring at it and trying to make sense of it. And for sure, Crumb's music is important. You know, the way it sounds is important, and the work that he did with regard to non-standard techniques on instruments. But his scores by themselves are, I can imagine that having like a huge influence the first time you laid eyes on that.
yeah, truly works of art.
Yeah. So you transferred out of community college and I guess to maybe probably like a state university or a 4-year music program at that point. Uh, had you been interested in composition before then? Were you writing anything or making anything original or even arrangements before that point? Or was it really that kind of transfer, that shift that propelled you into the interests that you have today?
Yeah, so this is actually the start of my composition journey here, what I'll talk about. So I was a senior in high school, and it was spring break. It was like, I remember like spring break, the weather always being really, really crazy. So it was just like a really dreary spring break day. And I woke up and my mom asked me to sit down, and I was like, oh, no worries, like whatever you need to talk to me about, it's fine. And she told me that my dad had passed away. And I was like, oh, okay. And I spent the week over spring break like figuring out, what am I gonna do? And I had a piano lab at the time, and instead of like practicing, because we split the time between theory and then playing our like assigned piano songs. So I spent that time kind of being really moody, broody, and gloomy, and just started to like write like what came to mind. And so I started composing as like a way to process this kind of grief that I was feeling. So over the next couple of years, I had this melody stuck in my head. It sounds so cliche, but it's like really a moment like where you just can't stop hearing the music. This particular kind of theme that I had going, I ended up writing it down into a string orchestra part and had it performed at my alma mater, my high school, like a year, 2 years later, I think. And it was like this kind of thing where I was just like, oh yeah, let me just try writing this down just to see what it's like. And after that, I was like, oh, maybe I could study film composing, because at the
Mm,
time that's all that I thought that music was, like
sure.
the music that you hear in high school and then the music that you hear kind of like in film. And so it was then at Wichita State where I got my undergrad from that my composition teacher at the time, Alex Turnbull Dunn, he's really great. He's like, yeah, film is cool, but like, why don't we look at some other things? And then the first thing he gave me was George Crumb's Black
Yeah.
Angels. So.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I guess you maybe just answered my next question, which is when was your first encounter with a composer? Was that at Wichita State then?
Yes. Which is always really funny because making the connection now, I look at a lot of string music, and half the stuff that's written for high school ensembles is like written by people that are still alive. And being able to like make that connection is very, very strange. But the first time I really thought about what a composer is, what a composer does, was definitely at Wichita State. So
Did you enter Wichita State as maybe like a cello major and then like you said you kind of just started composing, or did you come there as a composer? When did you know that you wanted to pursue the craft of composition as a career?
yeah, so I went into Wichita State with the intent of majoring in composition. You have to take like a certain number of theory classes, then you have to submit a portfolio to actually be considered an official major. But that was my intention enrolling. And I actually really liked my cello teacher so much. Lane Chukayev, he's just a teddy bear of a guy, so great. And I liked him so much that I ended up picking up the performance major as well. I was like, I need to, the same sort of attitude from earlier, I need to learn as much as I can in these 4 years. So that was like my motivation for that. I didn't actually know if I wanted to be a composer until I think well into my master's program, probably, which is kind of a long time from undergrad to
Oh,
master's.
sure. Yeah.
Um, because I was just like, I like making music, I like writing music, it's really fun, but am I motivated enough to dedicate the time to to kind of slum it out there, to try to get projects, to try to get missions? Maybe I wasn't until the pandemic happened. I suddenly, had all this time on my hands, and that also coincided with the event that is the untimely passing of George Floyd. I was suddenly kind of overtaken with projects and commissions. And so now that I'm having work, I'm like, okay, maybe this is something I can continue to do even after my master's. So it wasn't like I'm enrolled in a program to be a professional composer. It's like I'm
Mm.
just here to learn and have fun, basically. And then it just so happened that in the middle of my master's, I got the opportunities to where, oh, maybe this is the start of my composition career.
Yeah, this is something that we kind of talked about before this interview. Was your experience as a Black composer after the untimely death of George Floyd? And I know this is a very complex topic to touch on, and I really want to be sensitive to that. So I'll just kind of I'll just hand it over to you to kind of talk about your experience with this. Can you discuss kind of the nature of the work that you were doing at this time, and how these commissions, how this event kind of affected your creative work?
Yeah, so there's several kind of layers to it. The fact of being a composer and then being a Black person and just in general at this time, especially in the College of Music at Michigan State University. So kind of twofold. I'd like to think of this time as like my artistic slump. It's like all of a sudden people are wanting to work with you because of this major event that happened, and we as a collective want to repair this sort of like wound that
Mm.
wasn't caused by you, that wasn't inflicted upon you, but we need to fix it anyway. And so I was just like, okay. The nice part about it is I was getting contacted by people I was somewhat familiar with. So we had interacted online before on what's formerly known as Twitter, which was great in its heyday until it wasn't. um, and so it was kind of like this, in terms of composing, it was like this two-part thing where it's like, oh yeah, I'm getting projects, I'm getting work. And then it's like, oh, do they see my value as a composer because they like what I'm doing, or do they see my value as a composer because of this wound that needs to be fixed? And I'll put wound and fixed in air quotes. And I battled with that. I struggled with that for like a few years after 2020, deciding, if my art was kind of worth something
Yeah.
outside of this one event. My process changed a lot. Instead of writing with pen, I was writing in pencils. I was just feeling really lost and confused about what I should be writing and how I should be writing it based on this lens. Eventually, I got a piece by commission from a friend where we had met at a music festival a couple years ago. And I was just like, you know what? This will be my time to just kind of like, I know this person. We've been wanting to collaborate for a long time. I know there's no ulterior motives here. Where with everybody else, you sort of have to kind of like, I was sort of questioning, like tiptoeing around this idea of like, what am I worth as an artist? Yeah, so that's like my experience as a composer, going through this artistic slump. It's like, yes, I'm getting recognized, but at what cost?
Right, right.
Yeah. The other part, it was very strange, kind of at MSU, because I was in the string orchestra. We did like the online concerts, whatever. I was like, I just want to play, just have fun. And on every single concert, there was a piece by a Black composer, which was also very interesting to sort of kind of be in that space. And then coincidentally, oftentimes being the only Black person in the room, which is what it is, and then getting a little bit of extra recognition just for being there. And it's just like, this is kind of weird. I'm not really sure what's going on. I'm happy to be here anyway because I like to play music. I'm stuck inside the house like all day, every day because it's a pandemic. Like, I just need to do something. But on the flip side, it's just like you have all these wonderful artists who now you get to see them for what they really are.
Yeah.
I played a lot of Carlos Simon, a lot of Jesse Montgomery. Valerie Coleman was already getting played at this point, but like even more so. And you just see these people, who are just so great at what they do to just get that extra push. Whether or not it's good or bad, it is what it is. But it was kind of amazing to see how all of a sudden, oh, this is possible. We can have diverse voices and not get bent out of shape about it.
Yeah,
So
right.
yeah, or we can intentionally take up space by intentionally Black musicians, marginalized musicians. We can intentionally take up space without being questioned why we're there. So it's a very, very, very strange dynamic to sort of all of a sudden all of this thing is happening during a pandemic, which is disturbing, like destroying people for other reasons. This sense of isolation. There was just a lot going on, and having to process and get through that. Like not only do I have to deal with the pandemic and being isolated, now I have to deal with working, you know, 3 times as hard as my colleagues who now have this break and respite. And, oh, I'm getting projects. All my other Black colleagues are getting projects. It's so many layers and so many complexities. And having made it out on the other side of that, in one piece is really amazing. I'm glad maybe I had my kind of artistic slump, then. And then now I'm just so much more confident in what I am creating. And it's like, sure, it took me a while to get there and it took a lot of hardships and trials. But now that I am here, I can be here with so much more confidence than maybe what I was before.
I think what you're describing, if we kind of separate the recognition of marginalized composers away from it, what you're talking about, like getting a lot of work and suddenly having to deal with that, that's kind of a challenge on its own. And to have the added layered complexity of, suddenly it's because of this reason, and then like the fine line between am I being represented or am I being tokenized? I mean, and the fact that you were in grad school while it happened. I mean, that I can totally see where you're coming from. That's a tough situation.
Grad school is already rough without all the other external factors, and just adding in, it's a very nice layer cake.
I'm kind of interested in hearing more about how your compositional process evolved, because you mentioned specifically like you went from writing in pen to pencil, which is that's an interesting thing to me. But I'm sure like your music probably changed as well, kind of pushing yourself through this what you describe as a slump.
So grad school was really like a period of discovery for me. The first kind of piece that I discovered like my newly found process in was when Roomful of Teeth came for like a short residency and worked with the composers. I had developed sort of like a graphic kind of sketching process. So it didn't have anything to do with notes, just had to do with kind of like shape and form. And at this point, even through undergrad, I sort of started writing in pen because I wanted everything to be and feel intentional. So if you looked at all my sketchbooks, scribbling marks everywhere. Some things are written 2, 3, 4 times in a row, but I just needed to get it. I wanted to get it right. And I wanted to feel good before I put it into notation software. And during this time of George Floyd, I was writing everything mostly in pencil. There's a piece that I did for Load Bang, and then another piece that I did for Sputterbox, and a couple more that I was just writing everything in pencil and just not feeling too confident or proud of myself, and like erasing things instead of like seeing my progress linearly going from beginning to end. It was really rough because I just felt so unsure of myself. And it's like, oh yeah, well, how does that translate? But after this piece that I did for Will Yeager, which is the graphic score, which is also in pencil, but it's very different.
Yeah, yeah.
I needed that to be in pencil because it's graphic, it's very visual. But after that, that was like my kind of the end of my slump where I was just like, yeah, you know what? I can do this. I can be a composer. And after that point, I started writing everything in pen again, which is very interesting. And it took me, it was that 2 year period where I was just kind of back and forth between, what am I doing? Some pieces are in pencil, some pieces are in pen. It's like, what's going on here? Why am I like this? Why can't I just, make the art that I want to make? And so, yeah, I didn't really make that connection until after the fact. And I was just like, oh, yeah, I started writing in pen again. Like, this is really nice. Just getting back to that point of intentionality, which is all that really matters to me while I'm writing, is being very intentional.
Yeah, I like that. And I love Will Yeager. I met him a few months ago and he's awesome. So and I can imagine that he's the right kind of person to help you arrive at this point as well. I don't know if
Yeah,
you want to talk about that, but I just wanted to give him a shout out.
yeah, I do actually, because he's a performer who doesn't really have limits. I met him at Cortona Sessions with his ligament duo with Annika, and they were just such an incredible duo. I had never heard anything like it before, but what struck me was Will's playing. He doesn't really play in the traditional sense, and I like to think of him as a player, a performer with no limits. And so I approached this composition. I was like, Will has no limits. Well, how am I supposed to write something for this performer who is just so, prolific, so expressive, who has an arsenal of performance styles under his belt? Like, what do I do for somebody like this? And it's like, oh yeah, if Will doesn't have any limits, I shouldn't put any limits on myself either. And so I created this graphic score in mind just to sort of like act as a guide for no limitations.
And I have to point out, because we haven't acknowledged it yet, but Will Yeager is a double bassist, and that's such an interesting instrument to kind of discuss this concept of no limits on, because it's a bass. I guess there are limits, but what kind of things did you discover in working with him? I'd imagine you worked with him quite closely on this piece, if it's a graphic score and whatnot.
So I actually created the score in sort of like an ABA kind of form, and I wanted to contrast texture and color. So Will's a performer who has no limits. I imposed a couple of limits in certain kind of ways. So the first part of the score is all about natural harmonics. I think of all the string instruments, harmonics on bass just sound so incredible. So the first part of the score is about kind of working around these natural harmonics, creating this sort of really whimsical kind of soundscape. And then we move into the middle. That's more about some of the other partials on some of the other strings, as well as stop notes to give this sort of like kind of this sort of eerie kind of feel that goes back to this whimsical harmonic kind of section. That's how it looks in the score as well. It's like very, very cut and dry. But the interpretation, I was just like, he can make any kind of sounds, not just with notes, not just with traditional bowing styles, that kind of thing. So I was just like, yeah, he opened me up to like the bass being such a dynamic instrument that you can kind of do anything. And so when I'm hoping, I haven't heard anybody interpret this a different way yet, but I'm really excited to see kind of like how other people interpret it differently based on the very kind of loose instructions that are given.
Do you have very many pieces like this, or was this kind of a first time that you really committed to like graphic notation, for example?
Yes, this is the first piece that I've actually committed to doing a graphic score in this way that's basically just all images or images and like symbols. I have tried to incorporate some graphic elements in other parts of my score, but never anything that's just no music, just visuals. So,
It's also fascinating to me because of just the way you're describing this being just a turning point piece, and it's kind of a unique piece to you, and it's just like a beautiful confluence of things that lifted you out of this kind of stuff you were dealing with that you were talking about. So I haven't heard that piece, but I'm gonna go look for it because it sounds awesome.
I'll send it to you. The actual score itself is on Score Follower as well.
Awesome. So you're talking about composing for the double bass in this way, and you're describing these natural harmonics, which I you being a string player, that's probably second nature in a lot of ways. So would you say that your experience as a cellist influences the way that you make music, or is it maybe only the way that you approach writing for string instruments?
I would say yes and no. So I think my most popular piece to date is my solo cello piece Shades. And I wrote that at the cello when I was supposed to be practicing, which I think I was listening to somebody else who on your podcast is mentioning that it's like procrastinating and you're just like composing
Yeah.
instead. That's
Yes.
100% me.
That's me too. That's the only reason I'm a composer.
Yeah, yeah. So oftentimes when I was in music school specifically, and I was in the practice room supposed to be doing whatever for midterm exams, final juries, recitals, whatever, whatever. Sometimes I would just kind of like go off on and do my own little thing, write a couple of little ditties, and then be on my way. And so, especially back when I was in music school, I found a lot of inspiration of just harmonies, melodies, kind of shapes the beginnings of pieces just by doing what I wasn't supposed to be doing, just by procrastinating just a little bit and just going off into my own little musical world. It's less so now because I'm not playing the cello as much anymore. I'm taking a couple gigs here and there, but I don't spend as much time on the instrument as I did when I actually had to. So for a time, sometimes I think in my solo cello piece Shades, maybe you won't be able to hear it, but I was working on Saint Salvatore Concerto, Bach, Suite in C major, and I think some of those things you can actually hear in that piece maybe if you're a cellist or familiar with cello repertoire. Same thing with my piece Rhapsody for cello and orchestra. I wrote the entire cello part on the cello.
Yeah.
Um, and I was also working on, Elgar at the time and a couple other concert caprices. And I feel like some of those things really kind of shine through because I'm like, oh yeah, I was working on this at the time. I'm influenced by the things that I'm actually practicing what I'm supposed to be doing and working on. So not so much anymore, but I really do like I don't have the motivation to get it out. Being in cello playing shape is it's so hard. It's such a bear. So because I'm not in playing shape anymore, I don't pull out the cello as much for inspiration in my pieces, except for this most recent one that I'm working on currently, which I'm really excited about. So when I can pull it out, I'm just like sometimes I'm like I'm not feeling whatever I am at my MIDI keyboard. Like, you know what, let me pull the cello out and let me just see what I can come up with. Because that's the instrument I'm actually most comfortable on. Piano is like hardly passable.
Yeah, the piano is like a tool for me. It's like the equivalent of a screwdriver, you know.
Yes, I 100% agree. So, yeah, yeah, if I'm like feeling extra motivated, I'm like, or if I'm feeling really stuck, I'm just like, I've got no idea what's going on. I'll pull out the cello sometimes. Recently, I've been using it a little bit more.
Yeah, I am not a string player at all, except I when I was growing up I played electric bass, which is night and day, to like a cello and a viola. I could never bow, I tried it on a double bass. I tried to bow, not good. But I love writing for string instruments because there's such a physicality to that instrument that, like, I'm a brass musician by education, and there's like not really a physicality to that. It's just like wiggling your fingers for the most part. And so I think it's really cool to hear that you have composed pieces at the cello, and it makes total sense to me because when I'm writing for a cello or a violin, I am air playing, even though I don't know anything about like the positions of the instrument, or but that's what I have to imagine as a non-string player. So that's really it's really cool.
Also, like, I feel most comfortable writing for string instruments, and it's hard to translate that to other instruments. And you being like a brass player, woodwind instruments scare me because I'm just like the thought of playing with your face freaks me out. And so I'm like, I want to be like gentle and delicate. I don't want their faces to wear out. Let me give them plenty of rest, that kind of thing. But I think some of the inherent, maybe these things are inherent for every instrument, like scales, arpeggios, things like that. I It always translates really well for me via finger shape. So I'm always like, okay, what does this sound like on the cello? Oh yeah, I can do this on my instrument. they can definitely do something in this similar manner. And then the idea of texture, you know, you can get so many sounds out of a string instrument. And I always think, okay, how does this translate to, say, a bass clarinet, or how does this translate to a brass instrument or something like that? So the comparison is just like, mm, I'm scared of other instruments that you have to use your face to play, but also like, how can I bring my love of timbre, texture, sound on a string instrument to the other instruments in a thoughtful way?
Yeah, I like that. And I'm with you on the woodwind thing because, yeah, I don't know. It's like complete foreign language to me, and I just write and I hope for the best. I trust that they'll figure it out.
Yeah.
So, something in your bio that I was really interested in exploring kind of on a deeper level is that you say that your music is an outward reflection of your own introspection, which I think is quite eloquent, by the way. But can you share what this introspection looks like and how it manifests in your music? Because actually, I'm quite an introspective and also introverted person myself, believe it or not, because I'm always talking at people. So I do understand where you're coming from, but also what you're talking about here is your own inner personal world kind of shining through your work.
So these days, as I refine my process even more, I try to fixate on one really broad kind of subject or topic. And then I try to rework that in as many ways as I can in my head before I even start writing down notes on the page. So, a really recent example is my piece Cream Ale Gray. And I was like, oh man, I need to write this piece for, Bay on a Can or whatever, the festival. Oh, what am I going to write about? What am I going to do? And it's really easy to just get immersed in one thing for a couple of weeks. So I was like, what's something that I do every day? I drink tea every day. Okay, what tea am I really into? Okay, I'm into this cream ale gray variant. So every morning before I compose this piece, I would go through my entire process and just think so in depth about what it feels like and what it looks like. So not only take into account what the tea tastes like the entire process. Like, okay, I get my kettle on. The kettle makes noise. Okay, I'm putting my loose leaf tea into the tea strainer. Okay, what does that feel like? What am I putting in my tea? What does it make me feel when I'm drinking it? How am I immersing myself in this tea making and drinking process? And it's really easy for me to do that. But if it's something I can do every day, it becomes sort of like second nature. Another example of this, which is completely different from Cream Ale Gray, but it's the same process. I wrote a solo clarinet piece. And so that piece is titled Suspended. And I was really into the fifth cello suite, the Prelude and Fugue. And I was doing some analysis, and I was just like, oh, the fugue is just a bunch of suspensions. And so I thought about that and I took it apart for a little bit. I was okay, how do these suspensions work? I spent, like a couple of hours just analyzing, like 20 measures or something. How do these pieces work? And when you break it down to its bare bones and then you figure out how Bach transported that onto the cello as an instrument, this idea of two voices on a monophonic instrument is very, very appealing. And so I took that idea after some sort of analysis, and I was just like, this is my idea behind this piece. It's just like the idea of two voices on a monophonic instrument. But spending every single day that I worked on this piece listening to whether it was the fifth suite or maybe even a couple of Bach's violin partitas, just to figure out how we can get multiple voices, how Bach can be so inventive of doing this just one thing really, really well for like everything he's ever written. And so I just like to immerse myself when I start working on a project. It's okay, what is this piece going to be about? How can I immerse myself in that just a little bit every day before I start writing?
It almost seems to me like you're putting a magnifying glass onto things in a really creative way.
I like that. Yeah.
I mean, that's what I love about being a composer is, and what I love about knowing a bunch of composers is, we all live in the same world. We all live in the same culture and society. It's good, it's bad, and the way we handle that and filter that through our music is the differences that we all have in that is very fascinating to me. Because I might write a piece about tea that's obviously going to be completely different than what you do because we think about it differently.
Because you like different tea.
Perhaps, yeah. I'm a matcha boy, so
Okay.
I
Matcha
do love.
every once in a while for me.
Yeah, I do love a good London fog though. So kind of, I guess, in the same kind of keeping with this vein of your process and how introspection plays a role. There's a lot of pieces of yours that focus on just like everyday experience, like your piece Cream Earl Grey. You have a piece called Upstairs Neighbors, which is inspired by your own experience with noisy neighbors, which I think is something everyone can kind of relate to. I don't have upstairs neighbors, but my neighbors next door are really loud. So, um, so why is it important to you to write music inspired by these types of just everyday, almost, I mean, almost not, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but like almost mundane kind of things?
Let's backtrack a little bit. I think it goes back to kind of when I started composing and how I started composing. My dad died when I was in high school, and I'm processing this grief and processing my emotions while going to class every day, going to class from 7:45 to 2:45. Or when I was writing, it was always when I was in piano lab and not when I was ever doing anything else. So I think it's just sort of like I've conditioned myself, whether I realize it or not. Like these are my conditions for writing music. And now I just think of ways to make it a little bit less about, being grief, sad girl on Maine, to just sort of any emotion. They're all worth talking about. They're all worth expressing.
Would you say that when you compose music, is that an escape, or is it maybe, I mean, it almost sounds like quite the opposite of an escape. Like you're just diving deeper into what you're feeling, whether that's good, bad, everyday, extraordinary. That's yeah.
Yeah, but I think part of it was an escape before it became like one of my main sources of income. It was about just like getting away from mundane things. Like, who wants to practice all the time? Like who wants to practice hard stuff all the time? Like, I don't want to be playing these scales and thirds, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Like, oh, but instead of playing scales and thirds, let me just do something different. Instead of thinking about this grief that I'm feeling, why don't I just play some notes? That sort of thing. And now it's more of like I am magnifying on those feelings instead.
I feel like you've probably touched on this already, but I'm going to ask you more directly. What would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice?
The first pillar for me is always intentionality. The other thing that I've been trying to do for myself more often is to give myself no boundaries. And then the other thing is actually repetition. So, intentionality, obviously, like I want my music to be intentional. Sometimes I will focus on, the same four measures just to get it right, just to make sure it's just right, that I'm being intentional with what I want to say. Giving myself no boundaries, actually, instead of starting off composing with notes, like notes on a page, musical notes, I will do either a brief sketch that is visual, or I will do a kind of like character sketch where I'm writing what I want the piece to be without writing any notes. So then if I kind of get lost somewhere, I'm like, I don't know where this is supposed to go. Instead of having kind of like musical checkpoints that I need to get through, I have like characters and vibes that I'm sort of after. And so I'm not putting myself in this box where I need to be like, well, I need to have, not that anybody writes these anymore, I need to have a perfect authentic cadence here or whatever. But it's like, okay, I've written my whole piece about storm and danger, but I haven't gone to the chance where I need to reach the calm before the storm or whatever, or something like that.
Yeah.
So if I say, okay, I've got all this moody, broody stuff, where do I need to go to next, or what should I be accomplishing? Instead of looking at these kind of musical notes and be like, well, I need to transition to this key or I need to be doing this. I have a general character that I'm after that I can fill in the notes, texture, and timbre about based on the character that I've written about, which has been incredibly helpful to not sort of get stuck on the musical material itself, but to sort of be able to work through the characters, or sometimes it's even like about timbres and textures. I don't want to limit myself to the notes on the page. And then this idea of repetition. I need to be working on a piece like every day or every other day to sort of have this feeling of consistency and to and to hold myself accountable. Like it's a little accountability, but I always want to be checking and rechecking. So even before I start writing, so I say if I finished 3/4 of the piece, okay, it's a new day, I need to write new material. I will go back, I will listen to the whole piece in notation software. If it's applicable, sometimes it's not, but I will go back through and listen to the whole piece in notation software and think, okay, what do I need to fill in? I can get ideas from that, as well as this sort of like brief character sketch for where I'm going next. So those are the things that are most important for me in my practice in order to make sure that I am being number one intentional and then like authentic, like what I want to say is being said in the way that I want to say it.
Well, first, I want to say that what you're describing with like no boundaries, like kind of your pre-compositional process almost is like that is like huge. It's a huge part of my process as well. Just kind of like starting each piece rather than confronting the blank staff paper, I confront a blank page and just draw really crude timelines of what I want the music to be. And of course, that can change as you get into it. But I'm really interested in this point you're making about intentionality because you mentioned earlier, that kind of occurs with like almost like the implement that you're using to write with, like a pen versus a pencil, and you kind of dug more into what it means process wise. Do you feel like there's in your music, do you feel like there's an aesthetic component to intentionality? And I ask that because I'm trying to imagine what that might be like. Maybe the answer is no.
I don't think that there is. I don't take this comment to heart, but I was at a festival talking with people talking about music, and somebody was like, "Yeah, I don't really sense like a compositional voice, like something that sticks out that says to me that it's like this is kind of like Daijana's music every single time." And I like it that way. Like I don't approach every single piece and I have a set of tools that I like to use and like this is what my music sounds like because I want it to, I like to use this gesture or this thing specifically. I want to be true to what I'm trying to say. Whether that means something comes across as me sonically or not, I mean that's left up to the listener. Like that's up to you. I personally don't care if you hear one of my pieces and go, "Oh yeah, that's Daijana." I want you to hear my piece and go, "Oh yeah, that's whimsical," or "Yeah, that's very thoughtful," or "Wow, I could really hear what you're trying to explain in the program notes." Like that is more of what I care about as opposed to are the sounds that are made consistent with this idea of voice, right? I want everything to be different because that's my intention when going with the piece. Like the piece by Will Yeager or that Will Yeager performed, like I probably won't ever write a piece like that sounds like that ever again because my intentions for that piece were to, have Will have no boundaries or to place like a loose set of boundaries. And every other piece that I have before and after that have been composed with different motivations and different ideas that I have. I'll never be able to write another piece like Shades because I
Yeah.
never just have, 5 to 6 hours to just hang out and play on the cello. And that's just the conditions that the piece was written with. But the intentionality with every piece, it's like, what are my intentions? What am I trying to write? What am I trying to say at this moment in time? I don't worry about any of the other pieces that I've written. Whenever I write a new piece, like, okay, I'm writing a piece for mixed ensemble. Who else is writing mixed ensemble pieces? Let me do a Google search or your search on YouTube of what people are doing. So I never reference back the same set of pieces from before and going forward when I write new things. I'm like, okay, what is this person writing for trumpets or what is this person writing for orchestra?
This kind of question of musical voice has come up on the podcast a couple times, and it's always composers who say, like you just said, I don't have a musical voice. And it really makes me wonder, like where did that idea come from? I mean, certainly that's a thing, but then like after a certain point, musical voice becomes like well, maybe all the pieces sound the same. And that is what it is. But I think it's really, I think this idea you're talking about of approaching each piece as its own unique entity, I think that's a really beautiful way of looking at it, and like really going all in on that rather than trying to make like a uniform universe or whatever. It's a weird thing to talk about.
The compositional universe of
Yeah.
Tyler Kline.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah. So you brought up an interesting point that's a great segue into my next question, because, you're talking about allowing people to kind of receive your music as they do, like, and everyone will receive it differently. I mean, that's the case with anyone listening to any kind of music. So you kind of brought this up in an email where you said you feel the most interesting thing about your art is that people make connections that you never seem to think about. And I always think this is an interesting part of being a composer, because it's happened to me too. I'm sure it's happened to all of us. So can you give an example or two of times this has happened? And why do you feel like it's interesting? How does this make you feel when people make these connections?
Yeah, so a couple of times that it's happened. So the first time was when I was at Cortona sessions and I was presenting some pieces. They were all like very different. I was like my solo violin piece, and then a piece for like saxophone, marimba, and horn, which is like the craziest thing I've ever done. I'll never do it ever again. I like performers, I had performers like moving around the concert hall. It
Oh
was
yeah.
really cool, but I was like, nobody wants to move around. Like, it's like a fun one-time thing. The connection that Suzanne Barron, who's really great, she said your music seems to have like a lot of like space, and I was like, space. What does that mean? What does having musical space means? And I think in this instance was like actually rest. Like I would hate to use intentional again because that's not really what it is, but I wasn't intentionally like, oh yeah, these two pieces that are very different. One's for solo violin, one is like a weird experimental thing. But it's like the idea that you make that connection. In the solo violin piece, I was really experimenting with the breath as a expressive musical device. And so the space came from the breath of the violinist versus this other mixed ensemble piece where the space came from, okay, when the instruments were moving around and then they got to their new places, then something else happened. And there's this space for almost like reflection kind of like in the middle of this piece. And I was just like, huh, I never really thought of it that way before. I don't think I did anything with that thought or idea, but I did think about it for a little bit and I was just like, huh, space. Maybe I did. Maybe I was like, maybe I should put a rest here because space. So that was like one aspect. The other aspect is when people think about harmony or assigned kind of harmonies to what I'm writing. This other example of like my solo cello piece in Slump, somebody was like, "Oh yeah, this is like an A like 9 chord or something," and I was like, "Oh, I just did it because this is the position on the cello, and it just makes sense." Like, and it just makes this kind of like interesting harmonic device. And I was just like, I never really thought about it that way. I don't think about harmony that way regardless. I'm more of a counterpoint kind of girly. I'm like, how do our voices, and not in the strict sense, but like, how do the voices interact with each other and moving forward? But it really made me think it's like, okay, not that I'm going to incorporate this, but like, can I do more interesting things with this kind of device in general? And this motive, not the harmony itself, but the gesture itself is something that I've like woven through my pieces just a little bit. You can hear it in Shades. You can hear it in my piece for cello and orchestra. You can hear it in Cream All Gray. A couple other ones that are like hidden that I like don't want to talk about.
Yeah.
um, but I use it as kind of like this way to bring drama. I'm like, oh yeah, you notice this one thing about this piece of all the things that you can notice in here. Okay, well, how can I utilize that to my advantage going forward? So I don't use it very often, but when I do, it's like, all right, I need to transition and get out of here. Let's throw this little ditty in here, and then move on to something different. And I'm still looking for ways to incorporate it because it's become one of my favorite gestures to use if it is appropriate. Yeah, I call it like a descending thirds. You can hear it. Like you go, it's very easy to hear. Like you go from, you'll hear the shift in tonality. And usually I like do like a big kind of moment where I'm like resting on the new harmony for a little bit. But
Mm.
anyway.
I mean, it sounds to me like it kind of comes down to like you have this very strong sense of intuition, and people recognize that in your music. And you're talking a little bit earlier about your experience in grad school. You know, discovering new things and the challenges that come with that. And for me, when I discovered systematic composition, I suddenly felt like, and a lot of people around me in school were kind of interested in systematic composition, and it made, you know, up to that point, I had composed only intuitively. These were all new concepts to me, and I remember there was a point in grad school where I became very obsessed with being able to explain every decision I made in a piece of music, to the point where my music suffered because of it. And we had a guest composer. I don't remember who it was, but he was a composer who was like known for systematic composition. And so we had a master class with him, and he was asking me how I made stuff, and I like had a really hard time with it because I was like, well, you know, I'm like in this weird transition phase, and I don't know. And then I remember my teacher sitting me down and being like, sometimes you just make stuff. He's like, sometimes it's fine. Like you don't have to explain it. And that was coming from someone who also is like interested in systematic processes. So he's just like, don't worry about it. So I think it's cool that, I don't know, it sounds like you've really relied on your intuition in a meaningful way, and like I said, people recognize it, and that's important.
Yeah, I had to change my process because of that actually. I used to kind of like freely improv and then just start writing. And then I started getting stuck and I was like, oh, I can't be doing this anymore. And it was my first large scale piece, my piece for cello and orchestra, my longest piece that I've actually like written from very beginning to very end. The piece for marimba horn and saxophone, I think that's longer, but it's very free and improvised. And I was like, long form piece, I can't just be winging it. I can't just wing it. So I that's where I came up with the process of like the character sketch, just thinking about where I am and like versus where I want to go. And it made so much more sense for me for a long form piece to sort of like write out, okay, how should this section sound without giving myself too many notes to think about to help organize myself better. Because I'm sure that I would have gone way worse if I would have just been like, oh yeah, let's just write. Let's see how it goes. You know, like,
Yeah,
no.
I feel it. I feel that. You mentioned the crumb pieces earlier, but I'll ask you more directly if there are any others. I'm sure there are. What is a piece of music or a song, even a book, a piece of art, any kind of artistic artifact that has changed the way that you thought about your creative practice, or even, you know, maybe changed your life in many ways?
I'll say it's like a whole experience. So the first time I went to Cortona sessions, it was in 2018. I went a second year as well, but I went in 2018 as an auditor. I was like, I didn't have enough in my portfolio to submit to be an actual composition fellow, but I was like, I just want to go see, like, hang out and see like what's going on here, like what's up with this place. And that 2 weeks like changed my life because it's just like the newest new music that's going on by people who are my peers, number one, who really care about it and are performing it at such a high level. I can't tell you like how many amazing pieces that I've heard there in that 2 weeks that just like absolutely destroyed my mind.
Yeah.
It was really amazing. I think the two pieces that stuck out there the most that like stick with me to this day are Caroline Shaw's and Mani's To Us. More on the gentle side of contemporary composition. I ended up performing it at my senior teller recital. Actually, I really liked it so much. I was like, and then Kate Soper's Only the Words Themselves Mean What They Say. Somebody performed that live. I think just the first song of that cycle, and I was just blown away. This is the first time I probably heard extended flute techniques like that, where percussive flute sounds, talking into the mouth, the head joint, like just a bunch of crazy stuff, and just to have such an impactful message just happened right in front of my face. I was just like, wow. It was really incredible, and that sort of changed my mind, or not changed my mind, but that really opened me up to like what contemporary classical music could be. There's so much more on the avant-garde side, more along the, like more along like the traditional side of music, all just together, all by just really incredibly accomplished performers, and there was just nothing like it.
I mean, Kate Soper's music in general, her voices from The Killing Jar really has had an impact on me, and just hearing the vocal techniques and just like the theater of it and construction of it all. I mean, it's all really kind of profound genius level stuff. So I'm not surprised to hear that it had such an impact on you.
Yeah, yeah. Now that you mentioned Voices of the Killing Jar, I need to go ahead and give it another listen.
Yeah.
That was also another amazing piece of art. Yeah.
So you talk about on your website that you currently you live in Wichita and you teach music, and of course you compose. How do you balance composing with the work that you do teaching music these days?
Very carefully.
Very carefully, yeah.
Yeah, not so much anymore because I'm actually composing a lot more now. But there was a time where I was subbing, so I was in class conducting teaching instruments, and I kind of have to give it my all. I can only do one or the other because it takes so much time and attention, so much time and attention to detail to show up every day and to teach these students, okay, we're going to talk about this today. Hey, we're going to talk about a fugue today. Hey, we're going to do this today. And just talk about music all day and then having to go home and write it was impossible. And so I was just like, all right, maybe if I have time on the weekends, I can work on this. But it was just mentally exhausting to think about music, teach it all day, and then try to go home and write it. So I had to do basically a on and off. I had to teach for the time that I was teaching. And they're long term sub assignments, so I wasn't there forever, but like 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And then after that, like, okay, I need to grind it out and do this composition for whatever I need to do. My schedule isn't as strenuous anymore. I'm mostly teaching cello lessons, sometimes playing in some musical pits, which has been really fun. And that is a lot easier because it's less active teaching,
Yeah,
in my
right.
opinion. So now it's just like I spend either time before lessons or after lessons, a couple of hours just working, listening, doing the worst thing known to man, known as engraving. This is the worst thing. Oh my gosh. So I just kind of like I go with the flow on the days I teach my students because they're usually like free days. So it's like, okay, I need to look up music for my students. Let me do that today. Then I'll teach and then I'll go compose afterwards or I'll sketch afterwards or do something like that. So now it's very easy to just do to teach and do those things. I know you mentioned in the email it's just like if that influences how I compose, and the answer actually is no, because I think of it as more of a passive musical experience than an active musical experience. Like conducting, teaching kids, like teaching sixth graders how to play their instruments, that's all very active. But showing up and then teaching a student how to practice or teaching them new concepts on the cello, I think of it as very more passive musical
Mm.
activity.
I'm so glad that you brought up classroom teaching, because I think for those who have not done classroom teaching, they probably don't realize how absolutely exhausting it is. I mean, it's almost like a form of, at least in my experience, it's like a form of performing in a lot of ways.
Yeah, the most valuable experience though, and it sort of kind of aligns with how I think about music and sort of like my values. We're all in this together. So I got a lot of conducting experience, not this last year, but the school year before that. And it's way less stressful than performing actually. But this idea that you're in it with your students together, it's not like you guys are presenting this music. It's like we have worked really hard on this music for however long, and we are doing this together. And that was like a really special experience for me. It's like my first group of students that I had were just the best. They were so willing to just come up and learn every day. I don't have a music education degree. I have a composition and performance degree. So that was like really difficult, like figuring out the balance. It's like, okay, am I doing this right? Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? And they were just really incredible. and came to school every day just willing to learn, willing to listen to what I had to say. And that's also what makes that experience just so much better when you have students who are eager to be there with you, to learn with you as I was learning, what it means to teach in a classroom in that setting. But it's kind of the same thing. Like, I love chamber music. I'm not a fan of like solo playing because it's this sense of community. Like, we're all doing this together. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah, that's great. You mentioned in your bio that you enjoy cooking, and of course, you've brought up your piece. I guess it's not really cooking, but cream Earl Grey, which is inspired by the process of making tea. It's kind of, it's making something to consume. Do you feel? I mean, can we talk about this a little bit, because I enjoy cooking too? I'm sure we have a little bit we can discuss. But do you feel like cooking influences your creative work in any way, or better yet, is it maybe even an extension of it in some ways?
I don't think so, actually. I don't think so. But I think it's more along the lines with kind of like who I am as a person. The same way that I'm willing to always continue learning about music, thinking about new ideas is the same way that I view cooking as well. It's like, oh, well, I haven't tried this recipe before. Hey, do you want to try something new? Like, it's just that idea of like I'm here to be immersed in this one thing. I feel like it's very insulated in the sense that I would never let cooking influence my art or vice versa, but I think about them the same way. It's like, yes, I'm learning. Yes, I want to be immersed in composition for these 3 hours. Okay, cooking. Yes, I want to do something new. I want to be immersed in this also for 3 hours.
Yeah,
That kind of thing. So
this is like I don't want to say a point of contention in my household, but of course, my wife Susanna is also a composer, and we both cook. And I am a very intense recipe follower, and she is not. And I feel like being a recipe follower is like the opposite of being a composer in a lot of ways. Maybe not, but it's like I don't want any room for creativity. I want to follow the rules and then get what I'm expecting to get. Whereas she's like, no, let's improvise.
I'm also like Susanna in the sense
Yeah.
that I want to improvise, which is why I don't like baking.
Ah, yeah.
I'm like a horrible baker. I try my best, but like it's so difficult for me to especially try new baking recipes where everything's so specific. I'm just like, oh, this is so hard. So the only thing I ever go back to is like making brownies and banana bread. I'm like, all right, these are my bread and butter. They're easy to follow. I will follow the recipe. But I'm wanting to get more into baking like cold desserts, kind of that kind of thing, just to still keep it nice and fresh in the kitchen, but not like stressing me out to the point where I'm just like, I weighed these ingredients. Why isn't this coming out right?
Yeah. I, I I love that you approach cooking. I mean, it sounds like a hobby, and hobbies are great. And I'm kind of using this tone because I feel like as musicians who make music for a living, like our entire lives can end up being consumed by our art, where there is no thing that we do for fun. So it's great that you have separated that out. Do you have any other hobbies? Are there any other things that you just love to do for fun, not necessarily as an escape from composing, obviously, but just as a, to give yourself a more well-rounded living?
Yes, I'm glad you asked. uh, this kind of goes along with cooking. I'm actually really interested in finding albums that match up with the perfect cooking time.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
One time I listened to Caroline Shaw's like album Orange, and I was like, from beginning to end, from prep to the baking was finished, like I could make a loaf of banana bread, and I was like, this is amazing. And I've been interested in like this concept of like, okay, is there an album like kind of or like like one larger work that could fill up my time from when I start cooking to when I finish? My other kind of hobby is, which I could go on a tangent about this forever. I recently got into mechanical keyboards, like the tippy tappy tappy keyboards, after like accidentally coming across a YouTube video, like I think a year and a half ago. And what sort of sucked me into this hobby, it's very expensive. I've invested a sizable amount of time, not as much money, but we're getting there. We're getting there.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah,
I have
I
expensive hobbies too.
this is my first expensive hobby, and I was just like, oh my god! Like every time I see a new keyboard, I'm like, I need this, and I have to tell my boyfriend, be like, hey, can you please tell me that I don't need this? And he's like, you don't need it. Like, okay, thank you. But what got me into this hobby specifically was people's motivations for actually building keyboards. So, of the ways that you can build a mechanical keyboard for yourself, sound, feel, and aesthetics are the three main pillars of why people will build a mechanical keyboard. And I found the sound aspect to be really, really interesting. There are different sound profiles ranging from like, I think the descriptive words are clack, thock, and pop. Maybe like marbly, or sorry, creamy is the other one, which I don't necessarily like that one as much, but it's fine. I understand it. And so I was watching a couple of videos about people modding their keyboards, pre-built keyboards, people building their own keyboards, and I was like, wow, this is so interesting. And I can make this keyboard sound any way that I want it just based on a certain group of materials. This is amazing. So that's something that I will continue to dive into. I have another keyboard planned that I'm going to build this year. Maybe right now my keyboard on my desk. It's like my first real custom premium keyboard. I spent a lot of time and hard effort. She is a clacky girly, very loud, but I every time I listen to it, I'm like, wow, I made this and it sounds really good, even though I've been using it for I think like 6 months. And I was like, wow, I still like this 6 months after the fact.
Yeah.
I'm in trouble. So my next keyboard I'm gonna build, I'm not sure of like the profile. There's different like profiles. Like I'm thinking something more ergonomic. I'm getting old. I need to be concerned about my body more. But I wanted to have more of a thocky kind of like muted sound profile, just so I can have a variety of different sounds that I can tune into while I'm working.
So these are keyboards that you plug into your computer. They function like a keyboard would. You're just kind of you're designing the physical object of them, but do you get to customize it to a degree where you can add functionality? I don't know anything about this, so I'm like kind of thinking about this out loud right now. And like, can you add, for example, some kind of function that would aid in your composing to a keyboard, or anything
Yes.
like that?
Yes.
Cool.
So right now the way I have my keyboard set up is I have a 75%. Or if you take a full size keyboard, take off the number pad and then the home keys, and then kind of squish part of the home keys into the other part of the keyboard. That is a 75%. On the left side of my desk, I have a 10 key number pad that is a southpaw, so it's made for left hand users or made to be used with your left hand. So with this combination, which is really incredible, fantastic, I've just now gotten used to it. I've had this for a couple of months now, the left-hand number pad. I use Sibelius. They have the hotkeys, the hotkey number pad. So it's really easy actually for me to not even have my hand on the mouse. I do everything with two hands really, really easily, which has been a game changer. I can input and engrave just a lot faster now than I have before. And it's just like making work just more enjoyable because engraving is the worst. It's my least favorite part of composing.
Yeah. Yeah, weirdly enough, it's one of my favorites because it lets me, well, actually, when I compose pen to paper, I listen to music, which is kind of weird, but when I engrave, I can really listen to music and kind of just turn my brain off. But I think it's amazing that you found one like another creative outlet for fun, but you can also use that as a way to assist yourself and make your work better or more tolerable in this case.
Definitely more tolerable. But I find myself having more fun. I actually can't listen to music while I engrave. If I had like a TV, which we don't have in our kind of office area, if I had a TV that's like background noise, I'd be able to do that. But for now, I just listen to ASMR because I love that. Sometimes it's keyboard, sometimes it's like furniture, woodworking, anything that's like very nice and soft. No people talking, that's very weird. But it's usually keyboard typing or woodworking. And it really complements nicely with my keyboard sounds outside of my headphones. So it makes for like a really nice balance of like background noise that isn't invasive while I just kind of focus on my engraving.
So we're starting to talk about some non-musical activities that you do, which is kind of the perfect setup for this question that I ask everybody, which is, what do you think you would be doing if it wasn't making music, and or even teaching, for that matter?
It's hard to say. I would say if I wasn't a composer, I would definitely be a music teacher, like music educator, K through 12 kind of zone area. I found my niche kind of doing outreach in my undergrad, that kind of thing, where that's just like my zone. That's like my jam. Just connecting with young musicians and just like letting them know, not that they don't know their value, but like letting them know their value. Because like I don't know, like being a musician is like really hard and tough, but like the fact that they can do it, and some of my students, are just doing it at such a high level, or they're just eager to learn, and I just want to be able to feed that for them. If I wasn't teaching music, I would still probably be some sort of educator, instructor, not K through 5. Those kids, they're all crazy and wild, but probably somewhere in the middle school zone where they're sort of coming into who they are as themselves, and you really get to see them blossom. From sixth to eighth grade, you just see such a major change, and I got to see that when I was in the classroom, and I just really appreciated them and like almost admired them. Like I don't like puberty was so long ago, but it's just like you did puberty through a pandemic, and like you're still a solid person. You're still coming to class every day with respect and like willingness to learn. That's amazing. Like kids are so resilient, and just being able to uplift them in that regard. So definitely still some sort of teacher.
I'll let you have it.
Yes.
Is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from?
Yes. I'm a visual person. So the biggest tool that I use, which is not accessible to everybody, but some sort of writing like tablet, like iPad, any generic tablet for writing and notating. So my sort of process is like a round robin of just ridiculousness. I actually don't write in dynamics or expressive markings. The first time around that I'm writing on paper, I will input everything into software, make sure everything sounds good, and then I'll take that and then I will annotate, notate, make any notes that I need to make actually on my iPad before I then put it back into notation software. So it's probably really inefficient, but that's the one thing that's helped me out so much. I didn't have that before. In my undergrad, I didn't get my iPad until I was like in grad school, and it's just changed how my process has worked out. So any sort of like visual aid, I can't. Maybe that's not even like a good tool. I don't know, but
Well, I think the process of what you're describing is an effective tool, and I actually somehow don't have an iPad. I still see Xana's whenever I want one, um, but I do the same thing, except I just print off the sheet music and I'll pen and paper it, add dynamics like you're describing. So it doesn't necessarily have to be on a
on an
tablet.
I yeah, yeah. But like that process for me is just like, yeah, this is what really works. This is what's most effective for me personally.
So my final question for you, and you can answer this pretty much however you want. Use it to say whatever you want. And that is, what is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
I really thoroughly enjoy the variety of performances that I get from different performers. So it's not inherently written where I'm like, make your own choices, do whatever you want. But I really value that performers think about their own practice in a different way, and that every recording of my pieces should all be different, whether that's drastically or even a small kind of thing, because it gives you something extra to listen to, and I think that's like incredibly special. Like I really want you, performers, if you're listening, I really want you to make this piece like your own. So yeah, I think that's the only thing that I can really say. Variety is the spice of life, and I take that to heart.
Yeah. I mean, as composers, unless we're writing electroacoustic music or, computer music, we need the performer to complete the process. Everybody's different. And yeah, I would agree with that. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah. The best time that I had was working with any group of musicians was when Dan Ketter took my piece, Rhapsody for Trombone Orchestra, with his orchestra, Springfield, Missouri Symphony Orchestra. And I basically had like no input on like what was going on because Dan was basically just like, this is how I want it to be and this is how it's going to be. And I was like, hell yeah, Dan. Hell yeah. But it left me just being able to, even before the premiere, to just really soak in like what was going on, the process that was happening. And it was really amazing and incredible to see that, like even though I wrote this, maybe I have a say in it, like that Dan took charge and he made it what he wanted it to be. And it was just really like, it was really an amazing performance. And yeah, so I take that kind of to heart.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Daijana, this was awesome. It's been so great kind of getting to know you better, and I mean, it was a lot of fun. I love the hearing about the keyboard stuff, but of course your musical journey is amazing too. So thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, it was really incredible being here. And just thank you for this thought provoking conversation.
I really can't say enough how much I appreciate a lot of what Daijana shared today with some of those very complex and vulnerable topics that have informed her journey in music composition, and I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. Daijana Wallace is on the web at daijanawallace.com, spelled Daijana Wallace.com. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. And definitely check out her site because she's got a lot of videos of the music we talked about today, and it's all extremely good stuff. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We are online at looseleaftransmissions.com, where you can find more episodes of the podcast, as well as ways to support us. That'll do it for this episode of the podcast. Really great to be with you today, and until next time, take care.